Welcome to today's webinar, Implementing an Electrical Safety Work Program, NFPA 70E, hosted by NTT Workforce Development Institute. If you have a question at any point during today's presentation, please type your question in the text chat field located at the bottom of your screen and click Send. We will answer as many questions as possible, if time allows, at the end of Bob's presentation. If your questions are not addressed, we will respond via email using the contact information you provided when you registered. You can also contact Debbie Jones, whose information will be displayed at the end of the presentation. Our presenter today is Robert Bob LeRoy. Bob joined NTT after 34 years in the electrical trade as a master electrician, contractor, and electrical supervisor in a power-generating environment. With over 16 years in electrical instruction, he has presented electrical courses to our major clients across the U.S., Canada, Africa, the Middle East, and Indonesia. As a director of electrical programs delivery, he is responsible for the content and consistent delivery of electrical safety classes by approximately 30 instructors. Bob is highly regarded among our international clients as having a broad understanding of developing the electrical workforce for a global market. He speaks frequently at client conferences to facilitate a greater understanding of company policies as applied to electrical standards. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. The PowerPoint slideshow will not be distributed. We will email you when the webinar recording is posted. Thank you. Now, Bob, I'd like to turn the call over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. I was scrolling through the participant list before we started our webinar, and I recognized many of the names here today. So hello to you that I have already known, and welcome to you that are just meeting me today. Today's subject matter is going to be about implementing an electrical safe work program and the fact that it is more than just training. You heard a bit of my biography. I've been in the electrical trade now for 40 years, and I've got a fairly diverse experience and awareness of what's going on around the globe. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in implementing an electrical safe work program, it really is more than just providing a training class. In diverse cultures, even those all around the world, some things are very common and predictable. Preparation is essential for a desired outcome, but people make immediate decisions that affect the rest of their lives. And by that I mean, a training class may give us the preparation that we may expect for some work practice, but if we allow the workers to make these decisions based upon their own awareness or their own freedom in the job site, overzealousness, if you will, then very often our outcome is less than we've desired. We've got to integrate these concepts into every workplace decision. No matter where I go around the globe, whatever country or culture that I find myself in, I've noticed that workers really are the same everywhere. Workplace decisions are based upon three very specific practices. One of them is their past experience. Unfortunately, past experience is often interpreted as the bad habits that they've developed. They also make these decisions based upon their comfort level. And this is where I find it is probably extremely dangerous. Too often, electrical workers, through their bad habits, have gotten themselves into a confidence or comfort level that they don't even recognize as being unsafe. And more so what I see is an immediate need to address the pressures to meet production of demands. Basically, the production demands cause a worker many times to think not so much in a safe way, but in getting the work accomplished so that production may go on. All of these are working against our goal of electrical safety. Now, most of you on this call are either safety professionals or are supervisors or managers that follow the lost time incidence rates. And statistics are really only telling us one side of the story. The good news is, in the United States and in most countries that I've been to, the numbers are really trending downward over the past 20 years, and I do attribute this to two very specific things: an increase of awareness of what electrical energy can do and training on the work practices from companies. Fatality rates have decreased. Lost time incident rates have decreased as well. Well, the lost time incident rates are only showing one side of the story. All of this sounds very good, but what can we expect today? Recently released statistics by the Electrical Safety Foundation are taking us up to about the year 2010 in the United States, give us this prediction on what's going to take place within the electrical workforce. On an annual basis, we can expect the possibility of 300 deaths and 3,500 injuries from working with electricity. That's basically one fatality for every 13 injuries. Now, if we concentrate ourselves only on lost time incidents, the lost time incidents are fairly low compared to other means of injury, but the results are much more catastrophic. 70% of those injured were non-electricians. These were people that were utilizing electricity to get their tasks done, but were not trained in the proper use of electrical energy. And 68% of those injured will die before the age of 45. An interesting quote that I heard recently was comparing electricity to a toxic substance, mainly things like chemicals or acids. Electricity is very toxic. When we're talking about chemicals, we obviously don't touch them with our bare hands because we have some type of damage that's going to take place, but fortunately, many times it takes repeated exposure for that damage to be very catastrophic. But with electricity, as little as one touch can kill. So our goal remains the same: 0 incidents and fatality rates. Well, in our economically crippled and globally competitive challenged environment, is this goal really attainable? By that I mean, companies today have been forced to focus more on budgetary issues and competing with global competitors, and many times safety, if we're looking only at incident rates, gets pushed down the priority ladder somewhat. So are these goals really attainable? Yes, they are, and I believe if we'll follow a specific pathway that we can see that as a successful goal. If we don't involve management, though, success is already threatened. So what I'm suggesting is that safety, safe work practices, must be an established practice and policy that's agreed to from the top down. There must be some information and training taking place even for those in the management realm so they understand how work practices in today's environments have actually changed. These work practices must be written so that no question takes place in the field. Must be clear expectations about how electrical work is to be accomplished and who is going to be able to do that work. If we devise ways to limit the decisions that must be made in the workplace, then our safety will definitely be increased. And these written policies and procedures must be enforced, even if it costs more to get the job done. Because in the long run, when safety is compromised, the expense can be extremely catastrophic. So electrical safe work practices in an electrical safety program must be established. But it's more than just training. We have to change the culture, not just the conditions that the workers are working themselves in. Cultures are changed when electrical safe work practices are monitored for compliance and modeled by all workers. Training simply informs what needs to be done, but actions affect the culture of the workplace. So along this road, I'll suggest that there's 5 milestones that we can use along this journey. The first one is that we have to develop safe electrical workers. Now, in my experience, in my training and my career as an electrical supervisor, I had the opportunity to do a lot of hiring, as many of you do. And what I found myself doing was that I was looking at electrical workers at their competency level and not asking, how safe would they complete this work task. It was more than just a training class. They had to have a demonstrated understanding of their expectations and how they were going to accomplish this work task. The second milestone, then, can be conducting an electrical hazard analysis. Now, many times we concentrate in this analysis on the facility, but I suggest as well that this electrical hazard analysis needs to be accomplished as well on the culture within our facility. What are we really dealing with? Are we dealing with workers that are highly competent, yet they're uncontrolled? They feel that it is more important to get the job done than to get the job done safely. What we need to do is to develop safe work practices. Now, safe work practices need to be clear, they need to be concise, and they must be enforced consistently. No matter the facility condition at the time, whether it's in an emergency situation or not, workers need to know that I need to follow safe work practices to accomplish this work. These safe work practices need to be understood from the field standpoint as well as for those supervising the field workers. The production individuals need to understand the confines around working of the electrical work safely. In other words, it might take a little bit longer to get this done, but the fact that it has to get done safely cannot be compromised. And it needs to be understood from the management level as well. A fourth milestone along this journey is sustaining this compliance. A lot of efforts I see in companies to establish work practices, almost as if once it is established, the issue is now done with and we can just kind of move on to something else. But electrical safe work practices, this electrical safety culture, is something that must continually evolve. It must be audited and monitored on both an annual and an ongoing basis so that when deficiencies are noted, they can be very quickly addressed. And finally, there must be some global applications as well. By that I mean many of the companies that are listening in today have either multiple sites within the United States or the United States and Canada or North America, or they may have sites around the world. Identifying and overcoming cultural or country regional obstacles must be done to have consistent applications. So the question is, where do we begin? What are some of the key components to the electrical safe work? Well, it obviously begins with trained employees, technically trained for safe work, and supervision to be informed to allow it to happen. A code-compliant work site. By code-compliant, I mean there are installation standards that are applicable in every part of the world. United States, most often the National Electrical Code, Canada's electrical standards and codes. But every country has their minimal standards that an installation must be compliant to. But it goes beyond the initial installation. What I found in my career that is most often cut when budgets get tight is maintaining electrical equipment. I used to hear the argument quite often, well, it's operating, it's not broken, why do I have to spend money on repairing it? Well, it's not the repair that we're dealing with, it's ensuring that it will operate as it was designed. And the third step where we'll begin is trying to instill within the employees what I'll term as a safety DNA. In other words, whatever work they're going to accomplish instinctively will be done safely. This is from the top down. Sometimes we hear the statements, they're going to walk the walk. They're going to walk the talk. Well, let's find out before an incident actually reveals itself. So let's begin then with developing safe electrical workers. Let me suggest that competencies are learned. In other words, this is the training, the on-the-job training or licensing that takes place about the technical aspects of any craftsman that's in the field. But cultures of an environment, cultures of a company are developed. cultures can very easily be broken down. So we have to put training to practice. Guidelines are going to be required that have to be consistent and repeatedly enforced. We have to audit the workers to determine deficiencies. What training really is needed? Now, in my past career, before I went full-time into training, I had the opportunity, as many of you have today, to try to choose what training is actually appropriate for my workers. That needs to be determined by, first off, the job or the task expectations and trained evaluators within our company to audit what training really needs to happen. It's not just as technologies evolve and technical training needs to evolve as well, but regulations have changed, work practices have changed, and workers need to be trained out of their bad habits. The workplace must be audited to determine compliance. Obviously, installation compliance for the National Electrical Code or whatever country's code is applicable is important. We have to begin with a safe electrical installation, but that installation must be maintained for the life of the equipment. Understanding the expectations. Are job plans being utilized? In many industries, permitting for any work that takes place is required by that industry, and I find that when this permitting takes place, the job safety is increased dramatically because the permitting takes a very close, scrutinizing look at the work to be accomplished and determines if it can be done safely. Everyone needs to be aware of the consequences of not being compliant. The consequences both physically to the person doing the work, to the company, and to their career. And then the workforce must be audited to determine that culture. I would suggest maybe asking the question, what happens on a weekend night shift when an electrical emergency occurs? You may not really know the answer to that question unless you're actually there to observe what's taking place. I can tell you from my experience, it's many times in those situations where the urgency of the emergency actually overrides the urgency of safety for the individual. So in developing these safe workers, we have to determine what training needs to be taking place and how that training can take place. Obviously, training can take place within individuals within the company that can provide that training, or in-house changes, if you will. Those that provide the training in-house know the equipment, their people, and perhaps their processes better than someone from the outside. But what does this outside provider or outside influence really provide? It brings a perspective of industry best practices and can more easily assess the culture of the company itself. In other words, when someone from the outside who's experienced and skilled in looking at the workforce and the work practices are being utilized, very often gaps are very easily noted by that outside individual that can be expressed and then addressed within your company. So for training to be successful, training must be effective. Interesting, here in the United States, our Occupational Safety and Health Administration code enforcement or compliance officers have been given the directive to determine not if training takes place, but how effective that training actually was. What are the means to measure the effectiveness of training? Well, first off, training must be topic-driven. It mustn't just be something of a general nature. It must be very topically driven to make sure that all of the safety issues are encompassed. It's got to be very equipment or even process specific. Training must be documented, but the documentation is not just did training take place, but how effective or what is the feedback from that training from those that had taken it. So it must be tested, either written test or better yet, skills-based feedback to find out the effectiveness of that training. And not just did training take place that was identified, but when does retraining need to take place? The only way that we're really going to know is if we monitor on an ongoing basis compliance to what that training has taught us. Training, we're warned, must not be just simply a check mark in the box. In other words, this year I had electrical safety training. Well, I can do some other training next year and perhaps come back to electrical safety training on some predetermined cycle that history has shown us within our company seems to be very cost effective. Unfortunately, in the interim, what have our workers really retained? And how do we know? We have to monitor for compliance. A certificate of attendance is not a guarantee that training has been effective. I'll kind of subtitle that perhaps a level of alertness, if you will. Training must not be absent of any means of documented feedback. And even though technology is advanced to where training can many times be delivered, perhaps even cost-effectively, computer-based as models, the problem with computer-based models is they don't give us a reliable means of feedback that the participant really understood and can apply what he's been trained in the field. So the computer-based training is not an effective means, especially for initial training. It can be very effective for some retraining or some refresher training, but still must not be absent of any means of feedback and documented testing. What we're trying to accomplish is have only qualified individuals work on any piece of equipment within our facilities. But what then is a qualified person? There's several definitions that we can address here. The one I'm showing you on the screen is from OSHA in their 1910 or General Industry Standards. It's someone who has received training in and has demonstrated their skills and knowledge in the construction and the operation of electrical equipment and the installation and the hazards involved. You heard from my biography that I began as an electrician in the field, and most of my career I've spent very closely related with field work. I'm very familiar with the hazards that are involved with the construction and the operation of electrical equipment. But as I stand in front of classes around the world, I tell them when I'm talking about what a qualified person is, as I stand here today, I'm not qualified to go out and work on your equipment in your facility. And the reason is I don't understand how you've assembled this equipment that I'm very familiar with into your process and production or your installation. There's additional information that a technical person needs to be considered completely qualified. The National Electrical Code takes this definition slightly different and adds to it the idea that it is safety training to both recognize and avoid the hazard. And this is probably a good proof test to use when determining understanding and compliance. To ask an electrical person in front of that equipment, can they recognize the hazard that they're seeing, and if they do they know how to avoid getting injured or to protect those that may come into the area from getting injured, both to recognize and avoid the hazard. So in developing this workforce, it must become a partnership that begins with the employee and the employer. The employer then gives the worker the work practices that are going to be followed, but many times that training, that development must involve a training provider that will assist in assessing and influencing the workers and analyzing policies and procedures for both regulatory compliance and industry best practice. This is a good model that I'm seeing the industry follow worldwide today, understanding that regulatory compliance is just the minimum that's required. But industry best practices are historically proven rewards discovered by your industry, going beyond just the minimum to be able to embrace what will be the best practices for your industry. So what are some of the typical hiring practices used today? They're all a very good foundation for onboarding into your company a technically competent person. They would involve items like licensing or reviewing past experience or recommendations from past employers, schools or certifications that the employee and prospective employee may possess, whether they've had minimal safety training, the OSHA 10 and 30-hour training. This is general safety training for the industry and not specific electrical safety training. Mastering technical competency assessments, or even passing pre-employment physicals. Well, let me suggest that adding to that list, do any of these methods give us a good prediction of a prospective employee performing a task safely? Let me show you a couple pictures on how work is being accomplished in the industry. This is the way I was taught. How to use that meter, where to place it within that equipment, what to expect that meter to indicate to me if this equipment is working properly or improperly. In other words, I could successfully complete the job task. But the work environment today has changed dramatically. This is the way it should be done. We now recognize, unfortunately, through many accidents and injuries that have taken place, that successfully completing a task, it has to involve the hazards that could take place while I'm conducting the work task itself. Safely completing the job task. To be successful, a task must be done safely. Any other way is not success at all. So I would suggest that a part of the typical hiring practice in today's environment should involve a pre-employment and even post-employment assessments that involve scenario-based questions pertaining to the safety and how an employee will safely complete the task at hand. It's going to give us a good baseline for that employee's understanding and help to monitor the compliance. It also helps us discover the culture that exists within our company and define appropriate solutions. We have to have a hazard analysis for both our facility and our people. Conducting an electrical hazard analysis means that I have to analyze, first off, the worst work tasks that are needed. We can group similar tasks together, but let me caution you here to don't be too quick to place everything together. Quite often I see companies placing all 480-volt tasks in one group and all 240-volt and all higher voltage or medium voltage tasks in one group, when in fact the equipment is so dissimilar that they really need to be handled separately to be able to address all the hazards that are going to be encountered while accomplishing that task. The electrical hazard analysis must encompass the workplace, as we discussed earlier, the installation and maintenance that's taking place. And the hazard analysis must also encompass the workforce, both qualifications and training deficiencies, and beware of new technology. Just because we're dealing with electricity does not mean that the new equipment that we're dealing with deals with it the same way. But that worker that's developed bad habits will surely approach it in the same way if he's not taught or told otherwise. So in conducting the electrical hazard analysis, we have to analyze the work task. We use different names for this within different companies in the industry, a job hazard analysis or a job safety analysis. But this analysis must first off be written. If it is written, then we don't tend to skip over some of the minor items that can definitely escalate to be a major incident. And they must be enforced. They must be consistently utilized. And probably most importantly, the hazard analysis must be reviewed before, even during the work task, and especially after the job has been completed. so that any type of a deficiency can be identified and can be addressed before an incident may take place. A job safety analysis must involve at least what I would consider these 8 areas. It must involve the task to be performed, the equipment and the direct hazards to be involved, and the hazards in the area of the intended work to be accomplished. Electrical equipment is installed in many different environments. We have electrical equipment installation standards that would allow us to change the equipment enclosures depending upon the environment. But quite often, I find that in a job hazard analysis, the hazards in the area are not always addressed in this analysis prior to the work. Knowing what work is going to take place during the course of me doing this task. In other words, what activity is happening within the facility that I need to include within my hazard analysis. The number of workers for the task and the qualifications of those workers. Quite often I'm asked, what is the minimum number of workers to get this task completed? What does the regulations require as the minimum number? Because, quite honestly, budgetings are a major concern for companies today. There are some requirements from our OSHA standards and different governmental regulations that above a certain voltage does require 2 qualified workers to do the task. And that voltage is above 600 volts. But quite often what I'm seeing today with the major industries is that to follow industry best practices, the question is not what voltage requires more than one person, but what's the risk involved during this task no matter what the voltage is. Many times I'm seeing companies involving 2 workers at any exposed voltage above 50 volts. Protection of the workers and protection of those that could be in the area while this work is being accomplished. We have set requirements for establishing boundaries and controlling activity around this electrical work so that those that are not qualified could not touch it. And finally, the 8th step, emergency response. Now, you would think that if we follow the first 7 steps, that the 8th step wouldn't really be needed. In my 20 years in an electrical utility, I was involved with an emergency response team. For many of those years, I was heading that team. And what I found is that many times when we did our post-accident review and paperwork, that if we had found out the work that was going to be accomplished and followed these first 7 steps, and then established a proper emergency response, that the incident could have been lessened. What I'm suggesting is that we prepare for the unexpected. I can tell you from experience that in an emergency, it is so mentally overcoming, that is when training takes over. If we don't train for the unexpected, we can have a pretty predictable response, and that is that the incident will be greatly increased. In conducting this hazard analysis, we need to make sure we have installation standards compliance, maintenance completion, and mitigation possibilities considered. In today's best practices, when we use hazard control measures, there's basically 6 steps in our design that we would follow. The first 2 steps involve eliminating certain hazards or substituting certain equipment because they are inherently less hazardous. Following engineering controls and warnings in our design stage. Establishing administrative controls during the course of the work, and then providing personal protective equipment. We must consider the effectiveness of each of these. When we look at the document that's used most often in the United States today, the NFPA 70E, Canada's version Z462-12, they really are only dealing with engineering controls, warning, administrative controls, and protective equipment. There is no mandate for eliminating certain equipment or substituting others that might be better. All of these are minimal requirements Some examples today of following a more complete electrical safety program involving both elimination and substitution of this equipment would be things like arc-resistant switchgear, or placing within our adjustable trip breakers a maintenance trip setting that would lessen the exposure of a worker if he was doing troubleshooting techniques of the equipment that is downstream. The electrical safety program must involve the first two, elimination and substitution, to be completely successful. The workforce itself needs to be analyzed. Is all training up to date? OSHA and NFPA 70E suggest that tasks not completed in the normal work duties, or OSHA would define that as within 1 year, need to be retrained for that individual before they're asked to do it again. Are the resources readily available for this work to be accomplished? The last thing I want to hear when I'm going to assign a worker to a certain task is, I think I can do that. Well, that's a pretty good indication that he probably cannot. And safety is observed as being number one. Perhaps an example here would be, before any electrical equipment is opened up for any troubleshooting to take place, are boundaries being established around that equipment at the appropriate distances to protect both the workers that could wander into the area and making sure that that worker that's doing the task is going to be left alone to concentrate on the hazard that he's going to be encountering. The third milestone, developing the electrical safe work practices. NFPA 70E gives us two very interesting statements in the 2012 versions. It's the responsibility of the employer to provide the safety-related work practices and then train the employee who shall then implement them in the field. Now, quite often we seem to think that if we hire qualified and competent and technical electrical workers, that they inherently are going to do the work safely, and I don't have to direct all of their activities. Well, the second statement is very interesting. The employer shall implement and document an overall electrical safety program that directs activity appropriate for the electrical hazards, voltage, energy level, and circuit conditions. In other words, I can't assume that a competent electrical worker is necessarily safe. I have to direct all of the activities that would be appropriate to that hazard that they're going to encounter. This is basically what our OSHA and regulations call the general duty of that employer. And that general duty involves three specific steps. The employer has to analyze the work site for the hazards that are involved, identify the hazards that are going to be encountered. And if I expect the employee to work on or near that hazard, I have to train him of my expectations. And if he is going to have to work on that hazard, I have to protect him from injury during interaction with that hazard. Too often I encounter the understanding from employees that if I put on the protective equipment that's required today, the arc-resistant clothing, the hard hats, the arc-resistant face shields, the insulating rubber gloves, that I can pretty well feel like I'm dressed up to do any task that's required. And what we have to continually remind them is that the protective equipment, even though it's closest to their body, is their last line of defense before they could get injured. In other words, if any part of that equipment fails or is underrated, an injury is what's waiting. We need to design work practices and work procedures that will, in most cases, even eliminate their exposure to this hazard. OSHA then very clearly defines who can work on this electrical equipment. The work practices have to cover both the qualified and the unqualified workers. Qualified workers are those that have had the training, and remember we've discussed earlier that this training has to be effective, has to have documented proficiency in avoiding the electrical hazards of working on or near the exposed energized parts. NFPA 70E gives us a better understanding of what it means to be near by establishing a limited approach boundary for shock or an arc flash boundary for the incident energy of the heat. Unqualified workers, then, are simply those with little or no such training. Remember, the employer must direct all work activities. So I would ask the question, what electrical work practices are left up to the decision of the worker in the field in your facilities? Are you confident that the decisions that they're going to make are going to be the safest decisions that can be made? So in this roadmap to safety, we have to establish as employers the policies on what I think that employee can or cannot do. That's my responsibility as an employer. Regardless of his technical expertise on my facility, this is what I will allow you to do electrically. I then must establish how that work is going to be accomplished. That's where our procedures and practices and work tasks come in. How I'm going to allow him to do and to accomplish those tasks. And thirdly, what are the protective means that are going to be utilized? Not just the protective equipment, but also the work practices can be used as tools then for their safety. Establishing within this electrical safe work program a management for change. Any change that's noticed because of equipment changes or process changes or even regulatory changes, they must be immediately incorporated into the electrical system, the work practices, and lessons learned as we review job hazard analysis. I would ask then, is there a near-miss policy existing at your facility? Are these near misses reviewed at all levels? Not just the field level, not just the immediate supervision, but do we need to address this near miss from a policy level to make sure that we're not going to encounter it again? Some interesting statistics have been discovered and unveiled here in the last year or so that really are kind of astounding when we look at who's getting injured from electrical work. Over 1/2 of worker electrocutions are from those not doing electrical work in their normal job duties. In other words, these are folks like laborers, the managers who are just simply going through the field to see what's taking place. Even things like truck drivers driving underneath power lines, roofers exposed to those proximity of power lines on the roofs, carpenters, even landscapers and groundskeepers that are digging and get down into the electrical lines. Can you see why NFPA 70E is so specific that an employer must direct all activities when it's dealing with electrical work on their work site? We must put in place hazard control measures. Two major components of these hazard control measures. We have to have a workplace, auditing and monitoring. We have to have a workforce, qualifications, and compliance. One of the easier ways to help accomplish this is through the use of written work procedures. This written work procedure can be an objective way for an employer to establish and monitor understandings and ongoing compliance to establish electrical safe work practices. With the use of written work procedures, work activity will then be directed. It will provide consistent expected outcomes. It will control worker creativity. Now, I understand that many times creativity from the workforce is essential. We're trying to solve some very complex problems for our equipment and production in the field. But creativity must be established and done in a controlled way. Written work procedures will assist in establishing a safety culture. It will assist us in monitoring that safety culture and prevent unnecessary hazard exposures. Written work procedures, then, establish the expected work practices. They determine the skills proficiency. In the process of developing work procedures, I have to determine what are the hazards from the process, the equipment, the time of day, the environment, and what are the qualifications, the training, and the skills that are needed to accomplish this task. The work practices must be evaluated to be monitored. It's going to provide the baseline for determining that understanding and can also be used as a tool to monitor compliance. Well, I'm sure the question in your mind then is, who can then be the person to monitor this workplace, this work that's taking place in my facility? Does this necessarily need to be an electrical competent person? Well, I would suggest to you that the electrical work practice evaluator can be a trained employee. Typically they are supervisors or in some supervisory role, managers or other designated personnel who can observe employee performance when compared to a written work procedure. In other words, if I have a written work procedure that I'm watching an employee complete, I'll know when he hasn't taken certain steps or bypassed certain steps because of his past experience or perhaps developing bad habits. They can compare that to that written work procedure and recognize mastery of those demonstrated skills or deficiencies in understanding and compliance. A very good outcome from utilizing these written work procedures and monitoring the work as it's being accomplished is that I will better know as his supervisor and employer when these deficiencies are becoming uncovered and when training needs to take place. So in these qualification roles, an employer is responsible for qualifying their workers, but it begins with the company employee, what we'll call the candidate to become a qualified worker. And these qualified workers are candidates for that title until they have demonstrated consistent compliance, proficiency, and understanding. The company evaluator then is comparing the work and the tasks that he's seeing accomplished to this written work procedure to determine mastery or deficiency to that procedure. Where then does the third party or a company like NTT fit in? We then can be that electrical safety instructor, the subject matter experts, qualification witnesses, as well as evaluator advisors, helping not just to determine deficiencies in the workforce, but to devise a path towards workforce development beyond those deficiencies that are noted. How about you that are on the line that utilize the subcontractors or outside personnel to do some of your work? This is definitely an interesting dilemma because when you evaluate who's going to be able to do that work, you obviously are looking at their technical expertise. We call them independent contractors, but are they really independent? What do your contractors understand about your safe work practices? How do you document their understanding? NFPA 70E is very clear that we need to have meetings with contractors, you as the host employer, they as the contract employers, so that nothing is left in a state that's not completely understood. What authority do your workers have to monitor contractor activity on your site? In other words, if one of your workers were to observe a contract employer doing something unsafely, what process do you have in place where that can be effectively dealt with? If an incident were to occur How would you document to OSHA that all activities were being directed? A key component then, all workers must be taught awareness and self-discipline techniques, both host employer and contractor employers. Prior to work, to simply ask the questions, do I have the proper information and training to accomplish this task? Do I have the proper tools? Even things like, what are the ambient or site conditions today? Will that allow this work to be accomplished? And more importantly, what is my condition today? Because I can do this work at home is not a reason that I can do it at work. Once this electrical safe work program is established, it then needs to be sustained. This is where our auditing and monitoring principles come in place. 2012 NFPA 70E, annual auditing, ongoing monitoring of the workforce. Using our written electrical work procedures will help us accomplish. 3-year auditing of the electrical safe work program. 3-year refresher training for the employees. The refresher training was established in its cycle, my understanding, from the 70E committee, because NFPA 70E will now be updated every 3 years. But from my experience, and yours as well, I'm sure, human nature is such that people that don't use certain practices or information all the time very quickly lose it. It's replaced with other information. So an auditing of my work practices as well as my workforce on an ongoing basis is the best practice. And a 5-year review of the arc flash hazard analysis, the hazard analysis of your equipment to determine the proper protection from incident energy. It needs to be reviewed more often if there's any major changes to the equipment or process. So in sustaining this electrical safe work practice, let me suggest to you, don't just budget for training. Budget for development. Development is a process. Training is an event. You need to budget for the need. The need is in developing a safe workforce. Well, there's some obstacles to this taking place. The first one is those within your company that are considered the decision makers. They have to have a buy-in. The buy-in, when work practices are agreed to before a work situation arises, workers are not pressed to work beyond their ability and their reasonable expectations. This is protection by policies. Establishing a multi-year plan, not just for training, but for development. What training feeds to the next training? In other words, what is the foundation and what is the logical next step in the training that needs to take place as I develop my workforce? Quite often I'm asked the question, well, what's the return investment for establishing this electrical safe work practice? What's the return investment for my training? Well, I guess I would ask, is this really a fair question? An emerging realization among those who track data and costs is an effective electrical safe work program can have up to a 400% return on investment. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've not seen the data that objectively supports this, although my feeling is this is very accurate number. But let me suggest to you that even if we don't look at this from a monetary return, it has an immeasurable return in safety to those affected workers. Well, another obstacle to implementing an electrical safety program, safe work practices, is the worker buy-in. It's interesting that after all of the competency training and the licensing and testing that workers go through, nearly every electrical worker will tell you they think they're working safely. But statistics simply aren't bearing that out. Too many find out after an incident that they were wrong. Compare work practices against your established guidelines and procedures. Monitor, watch the work that's being done, and review. It's very interesting, speaking mainly to you supervisors that are on the line now, but why is it that one worker may take an hour to get a task done, while another worker may take 3 hours to get the same task done? What really are the reasons behind that? Is it a training issue? Is it a confidence issue? Or might it be a safety issue? What if you're a company that has a multi-sites around one country like the United States, or an international, multinational company? How in the world do we establish a global electrical safety program? Well, the first realization is we have to have a global understanding. Basically, no matter where we are on the globe, people are people. It's the same worldwide. Accidents are the result of a lack of or inconsistent information. Accidents are the result of misunderstood expectations. In this economically charged environment we find ourselves today, too often I find workers who are not willing to ask questions or question a work practice for fear of keeping their job, quite honestly. That should never be an issue within our workforce. We should teach workers that in our culture, it's okay to ask the question. We would much rather you question the work practice than have to fill out an accident report after the incident took place. Accidents are the result of overzealous behaviors. Now, these aren't bad workers. These are workers that by means of their own character want to get the job done as quickly, as efficiently, and as cost-effectively as they can for their company. Unfortunately, when you try to put safety into that mix, it's going to slow them down. And many times their character is such that they just simply have a hard time understanding that that's an acceptable practice. We have to establish this safety culture, this safety DNA. So what are the incident rates that are taking place worldwide? And quite honestly, that's a very difficult number within each company to establish. Even within the United States, the ESFI a report that was just delivered in January, updating our U.S. statistics to 2010. Those that diligently look through accident reports for 8 or 10 years to update from our last reports had to literally read the incidents to determine where they best fit within our reporting. We have inconsistent reporting, both within the United States and around the world. But I can tell you from being in many of these countries, the accident statistics may change in order of occurrence. Shock, electrocution, arc flash may be different in its incidence occurrence within each company, but in every country that I go to, these are listed very high as the root causes of all injuries and fatalities on their job sites. Cultural differences, though, don't necessarily control all human behavior. Cultures or country differences are not an excuse. They're an opportunity for us to overcome. We need to provide training to those deficiencies that we've noted. We won't note those deficiencies without evaluated work practices. We need to establish clear written expectations and control behaviors through those written procedures. For global success, we have to focus on basic safe electrical work practices. Do your electrical workers know what really is expected of them? Do they know where to find the information if it's not readily available in the field? And most importantly, do they feel supported in their field decisions? We need to establish a structure to manage the electrical safety work practices and program. Each site of a multi-site company needs to have a single person, single point of accountability where any questions can be very quickly addressed. That person may not be the technical person to answer the question, but they've been given the responsibility, the authority, and the accountability to make sure that question is immediately addressed. Multiple company sites must be on the same page. One of the joys that I have in working certain aspects now within our company is going into multi-site and multinational companies and helping them assemble their work practices into one document. That can be quite a daunting task, as many of you know. But for this to be a consistent work practices across the company, it's a necessary task that must take place. Many times involving a third-party outside facilitator is what brings that to a success. Electrical work practices need to be monitored for the electrical safe work practice compliance, and noted deficiencies are enforced in a clear and consistent way. In other words, there needs to be processes in place where work is stopped, if that's what needs to happen, until training or qualifications, certain work practices are addressed. The most important thing is that work be done safely, not just that work be accomplished. For this to take place, there needs to be an awareness campaign for everyone on the work site. We need to establish the goal that no injury is acceptable. Zero injury rates really are attainable, but they're not attainable by accident. They're attainable by purpose. Hazards must be identified and removed whenever possible. The risk or the probability of an incident must be managed. We all know that there are certain times that we just simply can't turn off the electrical system to troubleshoot or to determine what a problem actually is. Those times need to be minimized when I'm going to be exposed to that electrical hazard by perhaps substituting certain pieces of equipment or processes that allow me to do my troubleshooting away from the exposure of the electrical equipment. And the work practices, the people themselves, need to be directed. So in summary here, let me give you some action steps to take away. The first action step would be you must assess your needs. And by that I mean you have to assess both your workplace and your workforce. What development or changes need to take place, and how do we put ourselves onto a path of developing those safe electrical workers? Once this has been determined, the question then is, can this be addressed solely in-house? Or is it better to partner with a training or workforce development provider? That provider then can provide consistency across the work sites and sustainability. So with that, I want to thank you for attending. My hope is that you were able to take away some very useful, specific action steps. And I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, and then we'll take some questions here with the time that remains.
Thank you. And as a reminder to all participants, if you'd like to enter a question into the webinar today, please type your question in the text chat field located at the bottom portion of your screen, and then click Send. The questions will then come to us, and we'll put them into Bob's queue. And Bob, if you would like to address the questions, if you just click the Question and Answer tab there, and the list will be highlighted there for you. Just click one of the questions as you move down, and the entire question will be displayed on the far right. So feel free to address them as needed.
Thank you, sir. This question comes as one that we hear very often. OSHA, their understanding is the last they heard, OSHA was still operating under the 2004 70E. Have they, in fact, adopted in part any of the 2012 70E? And the answer is no. In fact, OSHA has not adopted any part of 70E, nor will they. 70E is an industry standard, whereas OSHA is the regulatory body, the legal aspects. What OSHA simply would require is that an employer assess their work site, and have a plan in place to deal with the hazards their employees are going to be exposed to. OSHA does look to the most current version of 70E in their abatement process when deficiencies are noted. So we'll move here to the second question. This question, could you please provide information about code reference books used in performing residential wiring, 50 hertz, 230 volts? Wow, that's I will have to get back to that one on email. Basically, our National Electrical Code is dealing with our standard power systems here in the United States, and that is a 60 hertz system. That's one I'll have to answer offline.
Thank you, Bob. We just, I think at this time we need to close since we're just slightly over time here. So as a reminder, thank you all for attending today's NTT's informational webinar, Implementing an Electrical Safety Work Program. We hope that the information will help you maintain a safe work environment and keep yourself and your employees protected. If you missed a portion of the webinar or would like to share it, we will be posting the recorded presentation to our website. The PowerPoint slideshow will not be distributed. Bob covered a lot of information today, and due to the time constraints, we obviously didn't get to all of your questions. We will respond to them as soon as possible through email. If you would like information about our electrical safety training or other classes, please contact Debbie Jones or your sales account manager. Debbie's contact information is now on the screen. As you can see, her email is debijones@nttinc.com or 1-800-922-2820. Please mention that you attended this webinar to receive the 10% discount for any course booked in July, August, or September of this year. This includes electrical safety courses and others in these broad categories: NEC, electrical and electronic, HVAC, fluid power, compliance, and mechanical industrial systems. Thank you again for joining us today. All participants may now disconnect.